Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Holbrook. I am a professor of history, specifically Latin American and Caribbean history. And over the next few weeks, I will be your guide to the last 500 years of history in Latin America. So let's jump right in and begin with Welcome to Latin America. So I want to go over a few important details about Latin America. First of all, we're taking most of our information from an excellent book by John C. Chasteen called Born in Blood and Fire, the fourth edition. I'll talk more about the books at a later time, but for now, this is our textbook, and I want to just jump right into some paradoxes and contrasts of contemporary Latin America. First of all, Latin America is the global South. Latin America is also not only the global South, but it's also the West, part of the Western civilization. That sounds contradictory, but let me explain. 9 out of 10 people in Latin America speak a European language. That is Spanish primarily, but also Portuguese. A huge number of Portuguese speakers in Brazil, and also French in a number of the Caribbean islands and French Guiana. Also, the majority of people in Latin America practice a European religion, Catholicism, Protestant Christianity. So there's two aspects of Western civilization. Most of the world's Roman Catholics live in Latin America, and most of those Latin American Roman Catholics live in Brazil. The first non-European pope was chosen in 2013 from Argentina. Some Latin Americans still grow corn and beans on small plots of land hidden among banana trees, and often dwell in earthen-floored houses with sagging red-tiled roofs. International travelers who jet in and out of sprawling Latin American metropolises rarely see them. You have to go to the countryside with its awful roads. Most Latin Americans these days live in noisily restless cities, some of them postmodern megacities. Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Bogota have all far outstripped the 10 million people of Rio de Janeiro, Lima, and Bogota. So here's some pictures of some of Latin America's cities. On the right there, you see Rio de Janeiro on the banks of Guanabara Bay. And you see Mexico City. You see some of the slum neighborhoods up the mountainsides. There are contrasts among the countries. Brazil occupies half of the South American continent. Its population is surging beyond 200 million. Mexico follows in second place at 120 million. Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and Venezuela constitute populations between 30 and 50 million, while Chile's population of 17 million has the highest standard of living. The remaining dozen sovereign nations with populations under 10 million. In sum, the major Latin American countries are global players. So there's a nice picture I like, just for effect, of all the interconnectedness of Latin America with the rest of the globe. So also, Latin American climates and landscapes vary greatly. Most of Latin America lies in the tropics, so no well-defined spring, summer, winter, or fall. I remember how strange it felt to me when I lived in Bogota. The weather never changed other than dry season and rainy season. However, if you wanted summer, you would hop in a car or take a bus and go down the mountain 2 hours, and the temperature went from high 60s or low 70s up to 90. And you could take a vacation in 90-degree weather and then later return back to the eternal spring of Bogota at 8,000 feet. Latin American mountains are the world's most densely populated for historical reasons. Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay comprise the southern cone of South America. They lie mostly or entirely outside the tropics, with climates that are similar to parts of the United States. The continent's craggy southern tip is a land of glaciers and Antarctic influences. Got lots of pictures of the diversity of Latin America. Latin America is a place of extreme inequalities, unfortunately. In addition to extreme natural beauty, there are enormous disparities of wealth and well-being. Many Latin Americans live and work in circumstances not so different from those of middle-class people in the United States. But many still inhabit hovels and endure a poverty and deprivation rate rare in the developed world. The Southern Cone countries have stood respectably high in global rankings of social development. Most Latin American countries now hold a middling rank globally in a combined measure of people's education, life expectancy, and buying power. The small countries of Central America, notably with the exception of Costa Rica, are worse off, as are those with large and historically oppressed populations of indigenous people, such as Guatemala and Bolivia. And here's a picture of a Latin American slum neighborhood. In each country, they have different names for them. In Brazil, they're called favelas. Old. Again, here's some other pictures of some of the city life in various cities, as well as some of the social upheaval. Latin America is racially diverse. In Europe, Africa, and indigenous America all have provided to the genetic pool of Latin America. All three elements are present in every country, and positive and possible configurations vary. Guatemala and Bolivia, along with Peru and Ecuador, have the largest populations of indigenous people. I would add Mexico is not far behind. Many continue to speak native languages such as Quechua or Aymara, and they live separately from the Spanish speakers and follow distinctive customs in clothing and food. In Mexico, also, I might mention Nahuatl, which was the Aztec language. African genes are predominant in Brazil and most of the Caribbean, such as Cuba. Some more pictures of some of Latin America's diversity. Can't find a good place to stick my photo. And so you see the highlands of Bolivia. In the upper left, you see glamorous pictures of Juan Domingo Perón and his wife Evita. In Argentina, you see, I think it's a scene from Haiti in the lower left, and probably Puerto Rico, or maybe Rio de Janeiro in the lower right. So you see tremendous diversity. Major issue in Latin America is mestizaje. This is a Spanish word, mestizaje, which means mixture. Many of Latin America's people look noticeably European, particularly where large numbers of Italian immigrants were added to the population around 1900, such as Argentina and Uruguay. Probably most Latin Americans consider themselves to be some degree of mixed race or mestizo, a key concept in Latin American history. Latin America was the main destination of millions of people enslaved and taken out of Africa between 1500 and 1850, whereas the United States received about 500,000 enslaved immigrants, compared to Latin America, which received millions of people. Cuba alone got more than the United States, even though it's a much smaller island and a much smaller population. Brazil received at least 3.5 million African slaves. So you can see that this would have a great impact on the demographic development of Cuba and Brazil, even more than the United States. Do these 20 countries really have a single history. Later in the course, we'll talk about the term Latin America as opposed to Spanish America, South America, Brazil. The concept of Latin America we'll talk about later, but it is an attempt to include Portuguese speakers along with Spanish speakers and French speakers into one Latin American people. And there's about 20 countries that qualify as part of Latin America. Do they have a single history? That's the question the author is trying to answer in this book. And it's kind of yes and no. And we'll take a look at that. No, in the sense that a single story cannot encompass their diversity. Yes, in the sense that all have much in common. They experienced a similar process of conquest and colonization. They became independent more or less the same way, and mostly at the same time. So these are common historical experiences that tends towards yes. They then struggled with similar problems in similar ways. Looking back over 2 centuries of independence, one sees that similar experiences have washed over the entire region, giving Latin America a history, a well-defined ebb and flow. Here's a couple more pictures of urban Latin America. I believe the lower picture there is of Mexico City. Winners and losers in Latin America. The current free market growth, laissez-faire capitalism, seems to make the rich richer and the middle class more middle class and the poor comparatively poorer. At least in Latin America, it seems to exaggerate the extremes. In Latin America, the idea of a middle class majority is not a reality, but rather a fond aspiration for the future. There are winners and losers, rich and poor, conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, going all the way back to the arrival of the Spaniards, particularly all of those categories. That is the old conflict at the heart of Latin American history. Aspects of it go right back to 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But everywhere in Latin America, wealthier people still have lighter skin in general, and poorer people still have darker skin. The descendants of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and later European immigrants such as the English, the Dutch, the French, to Latin America still hold power, and the people who descend from the slaves and the subjugated indigenous people still serve those who came from Europe and the descendants of those from Europe. Half a millennium later, this is clearly the enduring legacy, rippling across the centuries. The fact of African, European, and indigenous American people did not come together on neutral terms, like various pedestrians arriving simultaneously at a bus stop. On the contrary, they have a history. To understand Latin America, you've got to understand that history, and that's what this book is about. In the 1550s, the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers imposed their language, their religion, and their social institutions on indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans, people who labored for them in the mines and the fields and who served them too at the table and in bed. After 3 centuries of this, things began to change when Latin American countries became independent. That was roughly in the 1820s. This is when the war actually in the whole constitutional republics began with the independence of the Spanish territories in the 1820s. In that sense, Latin American countries are ahead of the historical development. They're pathbreakers, pathfinders. For 2 centuries, it didn't work very well, partly because of the weight of Latin America's conflictive history. And there were 2 political ideologies that took center stage. But let me first say, going back to the previous sentence, Latin America's conflictive history. This is why Chasteen named his book Born in Blood and Fire. His basic premise is that Latin America has been dragging along a lot of traumatic baggage from the arrival of Europeans who conquered and who won, who were the winners and the conquerors, and they took possession of Latin America. They committed atrocities against the indigenous people, and they massively enslaved millions of Africans. So his basic thesis is that this forms a collective trauma of violence, blood, and fire that has plagued Latin America's development over the centuries. The two ideologies he's referring to are liberalism, or classical liberalism, which means limited government, and economic laissez-faire. This is a larger, more historical, and more international use of the word liberalism. In other words, it's not the way we use the word liberal in our contemporary political context in the United States. It's a different meaning. Referring to the core principles of the U.S. Constitution, a complex of values and practices that developed in the 1600s and 1700s in France and England. Some call it classical liberalism. Liberal ideology favored progress over tradition, reason over faith, universal over local values, and the free market over government control. Latin American liberals have been friends of the United States and of international capitalism. Today's neoliberals, which is discussed in the last chapter of this course, are a case in point. Neoliberals want Latin America to get with the globalization program. Neoliberal, of course, means new liberalism, and it's new only in the sense that it came back into vogue, and in some ways it may be hyperliberalism, where the laissez-faire is pushed to certain extremes that benefit certain corporations, along with the removal of regulations. Latin American liberals have almost always been oriented towards European or U.S. models, and that goes even double for today's neoliberals. The European and U.S. experience with liberalism has produced prosperity, not without problems, obviously, but the United States is generally considered to be a prosperous land of opportunity for most, in the minds of most Latin Americans. The liberal state and its economic adjunct free market capitalism currently constitute the universal model for modernity in the global West. The second emerging political ideology in Latin America particularly was liberalism's great challenger in Latin America was nationalism. Interestingly enough, that's emerged in a very strong way in the last 5 or 6 years in the United States as well. A sense of economic nationalism. Over the last 2 centuries, the surface of the entire globe has been converted from kingdoms and empires into sovereign nations at a breathtaking pace. Nationalism is thus a major theme in the modern world, sometimes destructive, sometimes constructive. Nationalism is the idea that everyone ought to be part of a nation, and that nations should rule themselves, not to be interfered with. Pendulum swing, the great pendulum swing in Latin America between revolution and reaction, reform and reaction. Liberalism and nationalism have alternated in ascendancy overall for a century, and their rivalry isn't over yet. Latin American history involves much more than politics and economics, however. Latin American history also involves rich culture and fascinating people, not to mention considerable blood and fire. Before we begin our story, however, there's a final consideration. In Latin America, nation building has been carried out over the entire 19th century in artistic circles, government ministries, and public schools. In the 20th century, Nationalism has rallied the masses and challenged liberal values like free trade. Nationalists want Latin America to resist outside control and influence. Nationalists appeal to the national uniqueness and authenticity. A national family must take care of its own weaker members. Some Latin American nationalists are conservatives who value the local traditions, especially the religious traditions. Today, many Latin American nationalists are socialists or social democrats who stand to the left of liberals on the political spectrum. This concise history is for U.S. readers who are encountering Latin American history for the first time. I strongly encourage you to read Chasteen's book. It's very well written. It's not a lot of reading. It's not dense, and it gives a lot of clarity to this timeline of Latin American history. In order to understand the new thinking in Latin America, one must become acquainted with the old thinking in Latin American history. In the traditional U.S. view has long been a story of failure. In the U.S. view, that's the stereotype that we have of Latin America. Until roughly the 1930s, the interpreters of Latin America focused largely on race and culture, considering the Latin American varieties defective goods. Outblooded Latins with too much non-white blood, according to this outmoded idea, simply lack the self-discipline and the brains to make stable, prosperous, and democratic societies. As Catholics, they lacked a Protestant work ethic, to make work not just a necessity but a virtue. And their tropical climates further discouraged economic activity with debilitating heat and too many sensuous satisfactions or distractions, such as papayas and passion fruit, quite literally grown on trees. In this version, Latin American history is racially, culturally, and environmentally determined, and more or less inescapably so. Between the 1940s and 1960s, World War II and its intellectual aftershocks put that sort of determinism out of style. U.S. historians of Latin America replaced the former villains of the region's history, indigenous and African genes, with new bad guys. Backward mentalities and traditional social structures that would have to be modernized so that Latin America could advance along the developmental trail blazed by other countries. Modernization theory was an advance over racial environmental determinism, but it maintained existing stereotypes. Greedy landowners and backwards rulers took over explanations for Latin America's problems. These explanations continue to focus the primary responsibility on Latin America itself. Then along comes dependency theory, which offered valid insights, but it is currently considered to be outdated in the field of economics. Revolution has going out of style, and Latin America's capitalist economies and liberal democracies seem to be working better. In the United States, interest in Latin America now focuses on matters that preoccupy us at home. So there's cultural studies. These are several ways of analyzing Latin America. So at the beginning of the 21st century, both humanities and the social sciences have given new prominence to ways in which race, class, gender, and national identities are constructed in people's minds. Therefore, the U.S. studies of Latin American history often have a cultural emphasis today. In the pages ahead, watch for new concepts. They are just as valuable for your understanding as new facts. And here's a picture of the modern nations of Latin America. You notice that Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana are included, although there's some debate whether they should be. You can also see Belize is included, even though it's an English-speaking country. So there are some exceptions to the rule. So this concludes our welcome to Latin America. The key terms that we learned in this chapter are liberalism and nationalism. And there's some study questions at the end for you to consider. Can you describe contrast among the various Latin American countries? How are they different? How are they different in terms of their demographics? How are they different in terms of their size and language? What kinds of changes have characterized the region in recent decades? Is it possible to combine them in one single historical narrative? And how has thinking on Latin America evolved in the United States? Okay, so we got through that a little bit longer than I wanted, but that is our welcome to Latin America. To all of you, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and I'm going to be posting these videos once a week as we go through this tour of Latin American civilization. Okay, thank you very much. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or need any assistance. Take care.